Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're diving into human history and evolution, but through a fascinating lens. Genetics.
Oh, yeah, really cool perspective.
You shared some excerpts from Adam Rutherford's book, A Brief History of Everyone Who Ever Lived.
Right.
So get ready for some surprises. We're going to uncover hidden stories in our DNA and maybe even debunk some myths along the way about race, ancestry, all that.
You know, it's really interesting. Rutherford highlights how collaborative modern genetics is. It's not just geneticists anymore looking through microscopes.
So it's a bigger picture.
Absolutely. He talks about teams of scientists. You've got historians, archaeologists, paleoanthropologists all working together
Wow.
to unlock the secrets of our past. It's this interdisciplinary approach that lets us understand our genetic history in a much richer way.
It makes you think what stories are hidden in our genes, right? I
Ah,
mean, Rutherford makes this bold claim that all humans, every single one who's ever lived, all 107 billion of us are related.
yeah. That's mind-blowing, right? But it makes sense when you think about it. Our species started in Africa. We all share a common ancestor somewhere, way back. It's like a massive family tree with branches going everywhere across the globe and throughout history.
Wow.
So we're all interconnected, part of the same incredible journey.
Okay, so we're all part of this giant human family. But what about race? I've always found that to be a bit of a fuzzy concept.
Yeah, Rutherford tackles this head-on. He explains how modern genetics has debunked the traditional concept of race.
Really?
There's actually more genetic variation within what we call racial groups than between them.
So those external differences we often focus on, they don't tell the whole story.
Not even close.
Yeah.
Skin color, hair texture, they're mostly superficial adaptations to the environment. It's like judging a book by its cover. You can't tell what's inside just by its looks.
This is making me rethink everything. So if we trace our ancestry back further than Africa, what would we find?
Now, this is where Rutherford's storytelling shines. He describes this journey through deep time like a color gradient, slowly shifting from one shade to another. We go from apes to early hominids, eventually all the way back to those single-celled organisms billions of years ago.
Wow.
It really puts things into perspective.
It's mind-blowing that we share a connection with all life on Earth. Makes you feel pretty small.
Definitely. And speaking of ancient relatives, this brings us to a fascinating branch of our family tree, Neanderthals.
Oh, yeah. Weren't they those, brutish cavemen we always see in movies, dragging women by the hair?
Haha, that's a common misconception. Genetics is rewriting that story. Neanderthals were more sophisticated than we give them credit for. They were the first Europeans, living there for hundreds of thousands of years before modern humans showed up.
Really?
They made tools, had complex social structures, even created art.
So they weren't just mindless brutes.
Not at all. And here's the surprise. Neanderthals and modern humans actually lived together and sometimes, interbred.
Hold on, interbred you mean?
They had children together. So most people, especially of European and Asian descent, carry a bit of Neanderthal DNA.
Whoa, so I might have a little Neanderthal in me. Does that mean I got any of their traits?
Maybe. Rutherford says some Neanderthal genes might be why people have red hair or pale skin, even parts of our immune system.
So my pale skin and my terrible immune system, thanks to my Neanderthal ancestors, I'm seeing my family history in a whole new light. But can't we learn everything about ourselves just by looking at our genes? Are they like the ultimate blueprint?
That's where it gets more interesting. Genes are important, but Rutherford makes it clear they don't tell the whole story. Knowing the sequence of a gene doesn't always tell us exactly what it does.
So there's more to it than just the genetic code.
Exactly. It's not one gene equals one trait. They interact with each other and with the environment in really complex ways. Think about it. Our experiences, our lifestyle choices, the food we eat, all these can affect how our genes work.
So it's not nature versus nurture, it's both working together.
Exactly. Genes are the blueprint, but our environment and experiences shape how that blueprint is built. To understand who we are, we need to look at both our genes A and D, the context, where those genes are expressed.
So let's get specific. Why can some people digest milk while others can't? Is that our genes?
That's a great example. Most adults actually lose the ability to digest lactose, the sugar in milk after infancy. But some populations, especially in Europe, can digest it their whole lives. That's because of a genetic adaptation called lactase persistence.
So their genes changed so they could drink milk.
Yep. And it spread rapidly in Europe in the last 8,000 years when dairy farming took off. It's how culture and genetics can work together.
So as dairy farming spread, Being able to drink milk was a survival advantage.
Exactly. Rutherford explains how scientists even pinpointed where lactase persistence started, somewhere around Slovakia, Poland, and Hungary, using genetics and archaeology.
Wow, impressive detective work. But with all the hype around genetic discoveries, how can we tell what's real and what's not? There's so much information out there. How do we know what to believe?
Rutherford makes a great point about how the media loves to sensationalize genetic findings,
What?
and that leads to misleading stories. He uses that example of the claim that redheads are going extinct. That was based on bad assumptions with no scientific evidence.
So not all headlines are created equal. But this is all pretty complex stuff. Can someone with no science background really understand genetics?
Absolutely. Genetics can be complex, but it's also fascinating and accessible. The key is finding reliable sources and watching out for simplistic interpretations, like thinking genes determine everything.
Okay, so let's talk about those mathematical models Rutherford mentions. Can math tell us anything about our ancestry?
It might sound weird, but math can reveal some amazing things about our past. Rutherford talks about a model suggesting that every European alive today shares a common ancestor who lived just 600 years ago.
Wait, so everyone in Europe is related to someone from just a few centuries ago? That seems impossible.
It's counterintuitive, but it makes sense when you think about how family trees grow. As you go back in time, your ancestors double with each generation. Go back far enough, those lines will have to meet.
It's like 6 degrees of separation, but for ancestry. It's a small world. What about those genetic ancestry tests? Can they really tell us where we're from?
Rutherford's actually pretty skeptical about those. He says they can give you interesting information, but they only offer a limited view of our heritage. They focus on a tiny bit of our DNA and can't accurately tell you what tribe your ancestors were from or their exact location.
So they're more of a starting point than a final answer.
Exactly. Our genetic history is way more complex than what those tests can show. They can be fun, but remember, they're just a small piece of a much larger puzzle.
Speaking of fascinating ancestry, Rutherford mentions this wild idea that everyone with European ancestry is probably descended from Charlemagne. Is he serious?
Yeah, it's very likely. Similar to that idea of a common European ancestor from just a few centuries ago, if you traced everyone's family tree back far enough, you'd run into Charlemagne's line somewhere. Our family trees are super intertwined, especially within certain populations over long periods.
This is mind-blowing. We're all connected by invisible threads throughout history. But is inbreeding always a bad thing?
Well, the Habsburg dynasty is a good example of the dangers of marrying close relatives. Charles II, the last Habsburg king of Spain, had a ton of health problems because his family tree was, well, a bit too close for comfort.
So too much closeness in a family tree can be dangerous.
Yeah, that's one takeaway for sure. But while it's risky for individuals, inbreeding can be useful for research. By studying families with close relationships, scientists can easier identify genes that cause specific traits or diseases.
It's amazing how much we can learn by studying both the good and bad parts of our genetic past.
Absolutely. Genomics has huge potential for understanding human biology, disease evolution, but we need to recognize its limits and not jump to conclusions.
So it's more than just genes or destiny.
Right. We're more than the sum of our genes. Reducing complex human traits or behaviors to just genetics is misleading and can even be dangerous.
Rutherford tells this funny story about a bet at a Human Genome Project meeting back in 2000. Even the top geneticists were way off in their guesses about how many genes a human has. What happened?
The winning guess was 25,947, which sounded reasonable at the time, but it turns out humans have way fewer genes than we thought, around 20,000. It was a humbling moment, showing we still have so much to learn about the human genome.
It's like we thought we had the instruction manual figured out, but then realized some pages were missing.
Exactly. That brings us to junk DNA.
Oh, yeah. I've always wondered about that. Is it really junk, or does it have a purpose?
Scientists actually regret calling it junk DNA. It turns out that stuff, what they thought was just filler, actually controls gene activity. The non-coding parts of our genome are essential for life.
So we were wrong to ignore it.
Yeah. They're like the conductors of an orchestra, controlling the timing and intensity of how genes work. They're essential.
It's amazing what we've learned in such a short time. It makes you wonder what other secrets our DNA holds. But if understanding how genes work is so hard, how do we even begin to figure it out?
That's a great question. It's one of the biggest challenges in genetics. Genes aren't just on or off switches. They interact in incredibly complex ways. Even simple traits like height are influenced by tons of genes, each contributing a tiny bit.
Like a massive puzzle where every piece affects the others.
Exactly. This makes it hard to predict what traits someone will have just from their genes. It also means it's crucial to study both genes and the environment they're in.
You mentioned genes can interact. Got an example of it?
Sure, Rutherford talks about the MAOA gene, sometimes called the warrior gene, because it's linked to aggression and violence. But it's not a guarantee.
It's still like a violence gene.
No, not at all. Environment plays a huge role. Studies show that people with certain MAOA variations who were abused or neglected as kids are more likely to be aggressive. But people with the same gene who had a good upbringing, no difference.
So it's genes and environment.
Right. This shows why it's dangerous to oversimplify behavior and blame it all on genes. Genes are not destiny, they're just one part of the story, along with our experiences, our choices, and the world around us.
Like we're all dealt a hand of cards, but how we play them is up to us.
That's a great way to put it. Our genes give us some tendencies, but they don't control our fate.
This is also fascinating. It raises some ethical questions, though. What are the implications? How do we use this knowledge responsibly?
You're right, this is where things get tricky. As we learn more about the human genome, we need to face the ethical challenges that come with it.
This has been a truly mind-bending journey so far. I feel like we're just scratching the surface.
And there's so much more to explore.
Let's take a moment to process all this incredible information. We'll be back soon with part 2 of our deep dive into Adam Rutherford's A Brief History of Everyone Who Ever Lived. We'll uncover even more surprising stories hidden within our DNA. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to our deep dive into A Brief History of Everyone Who Ever Lived. It's amazing how genetics can uncover these hidden chapters in human history.
Yeah, it really is like having a time machine, right? Speaking of those hidden chapters, Rutherford mentions this showman, Benjamin, the greatest horseman in the world, Andy, and his connection to Native American ancestry. What's that about?
It's a fascinating case of how genetics can challenge our assumptions about ancestry. Benjamin Handy was this popular entertainer back in the 19th century, toured with a group of Native Americans, even claimed to be part Native American himself.
Oh, wow.
And this ties into what we talked about before, those limitations of genetic ancestry tests.
Right.
They can show broader connections, but can't tell you exactly what tribe you're from with any certainty.
So you could have Native American ancestry in your DNA, but not know the specific tribe or even be aware of that connection.
Exactly. Now imagine finding a trace of Native American ancestry in your results. It might make you dig deeper into your family history and boom, you uncover a story like Benjamin Handy's, bridging the gap between genetic data and those personal stories.
It's like those ancestry commercials where people find out they're descended from royalty, except, it's a Wild West showman. Talk about a family twist. But this brings up Charlemagne. Rutherford says every European alive today is probably a descendant of Charlemagne. Is that really possible?
It sounds wild, but it comes down to that same math we were talking about earlier. The further back you go, the more your ancestors double with every generation. Eventually, those lines have to meet somewhere. So yeah, tracing back European family trees for centuries, you're bound to hit Charlemagne's line at some point.
So it's not about royal bloodlines. It's just how interconnected everyone is over time. It's kind of humbling, this huge web of humanity.
It is, and it really challenges those ideas of racial purity or superiority some people try to push using genetics. Rutherford actually criticizes this book, A Troublesome Inheritance, that argues racial differences are genetic.
I've heard of that. It was pretty controversial. What's wrong with those claims?
Geneticists and anthropologists criticized it a lot for bad logic and misinterpreting the science. You can't just pin complex social behaviors and cultures on simple genetic differences. It's way too simplistic.
So another case of being careful with how we understand genetic information, not jumping to conclusions.
Exactly. It's so important to see the bigger picture and not twist genetics to fit old prejudices or create new ones.
It's a good reminder that genetics is powerful, but it's not a simple answer to everything about human behavior or society. We need to be thoughtful and nuanced.
Well said. And this connects to what Rutherford says about the Habsburgs and inbreeding. They were obsessed with pure bloodlines, but it backfired big time, leading to all sorts of health problems down the line.
Right, Charles II, the last Habsburg king of Spain. All those health issues were probably because of generations of inbreeding.
Exactly. Some level of genetic diversity is key for a healthy population. Too much inbreeding can lead to those harmful recessive genes building up and more genetic disorders. It's a cautionary tale, Diversity matters for individuals and for everyone as a whole.
It's fascinating how genetics can show us these stories of success and failure in human history, like we're peeling back layers of time, uncovering secrets from our ancestors. But I have another question. Rutherford talks about a time when geneticists were puzzled by how some complex traits, like intelligence, didn't seem to be influenced much by genes.
Yeah.
What was the mystery, and was it ever solved?
It was a case of expectations not meeting reality. Early studies, especially with twins, pointed to a strong genetic link with intelligence. But when they tried to find those specific genes, using genome-wide studies, the results weren't what they expected.
So it was more complex than they thought.
Way more complex. Turns out intelligence, like most complex traits, isn't controlled by a single gene or a few. It's probably thousands of genes, each with a tiny effect, interacting with all sorts of environmental factors.
Nature and nurture intertwined again.
Absolutely. And this changes how we understand and approach things like intelligence. Simple genetic answers don't cut it when we're talking about complex human traits.
Makes sense. Rutherford also talks about Fred Sanger's work on DNA sequencing. I know it was a huge breakthrough, but can you explain why it was so important?
Sanger sequencing was the first reliable way to figure out the exact order of those nucleotide bases in a DNA molecule. It was like finally being able to read the language of life.
So cracking the code of DNA.
Exactly. And this opened the door for the Human Genome Project and tons of other discoveries in genetics. Sanger's impact is huge.
It's amazing how science builds on itself. One discovery leads to another. We've talked about the good side of genetic testing, but Rutherford seems pretty critical of those commercial ancestry tests. What's his problem with them?
He points out that they usually look at a tiny bit of your DNA, focusing on markers that differ between populations. It can give you some clues about your ancestry, but it's just a small peek at a bigger, more complex picture. They can't tell you for sure which tribe you're from or pinpoint your ancestors on a map.
So more like a fun snapshot of your ancestry than a complete family history.
Right. They're a great starting point, sparking curiosity about your heritage, but you have to be realistic.
So it's about not oversimplifying and remembering our genetic history is way more complex than any single test can show. But if junk DNA isn't really junk, what's it doing? You said it's involved in gene regulation, but how does that work?
It's complicated, but basically those non-coding regions have sequences that act like landing sites for proteins that control gene expression. These proteins are like switches turning genes on or off, or like dimmers, controlling how active a gene is.
So they're like the control panel for our genome.
Perfect analogy. They make sure the whole system of gene expression is working in harmony.
This just shows how much we still don't know about the human genome. It's like we're just starting to understand how complex it really is. Before we get lost in the weeds of DNA, Rutherford tells a great story about how genetics solved this historical mystery about Richard III. Can you remind us about that one?
Richard III, that controversial English king whose reign ended in 1485 at the Battle of Bosworth Field. His death was a mystery and his remains were lost for centuries. Then, in 2012, archaeologists found his skeleton buried under a parking lot. Can you believe that?
Wait, a parking lot? That's a crazy place to find a king.
Right. To be sure, it was him they took DNA from the skeleton and compared it to living descendants of Richard III's sister. The genetic evidence plus historical and archaeological findings proved it was the lost king.
Wow. So genetics helped rewrite history.
You could say that. It confirmed Richard III's final resting place, gave us a real connection to a historical figure who'd been shrouded in mystery for ages.
It's amazing how DNA connects the past and present, unraveling those historical mysteries and even changing how we understand things that happened centuries ago.
It is, and that's what's so compelling about genetics. It links us to our past, shapes our present, and influences our future.
This deep dive has been incredible. I'm starting to see how genetics isn't just about genes and chromosomes. It's about stories, connections, and the shared human experience.
You got it. Genetics helps us understand who we are, where we come from, and where we might be going. And there's always more to discover.
Before we wrap up, we have one last part of this journey. Stay tuned for part 3, where we'll delve into even more fascinating things from a brief history of everyone who ever lived. Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into a brief history of everyone who ever lived. We've covered so much, from debunking those race myths to all these surprising connections genetics reveals.
It has been quite a journey. And in this last part, Rutherford brings up this concept that I think will really make you rethink how you see evolution.
Oh, I'm all ears. What's this challenging idea?
He talks about Lamarckian inheritance, that idea that traits you acquire during your life can be passed down to your kids.
So like, if I work out and get ripped, my kids will inherit those muscles. I thought that had been disproven ages ago.
You're right, that classic example of a blacksmith passing down his strong arms isn't how it works. Darwinian evolution with natural selection is the main theory, but there's this new field, epigenetics, that's adding a whole new layer to how we think about inheritance.
Okay, so not Lamarckian, but something more complex.
Exactly. You don't inherit the trait directly, but changes in gene expression because of the environment can be passed down.
Can you give an example of how that works in humans?
Rutherford talks about this experiment where they cut off mice tails for generations. The babies kept being born with tails because cutting off a tail doesn't change the DNA. But there are human studies, like that one on the Dutch famine back in '44, that tell a different story. Starvation during pregnancy had effects that could be passed down for generations, impacting the health of kids and even grandkids.
Wow, that's heavy. So even traumatic events can leave a mark on our descendants genetically.
Seems like it. It shows how genes and environment are constantly intertwined. Not one or the other, they work together in ways we're just starting to understand.
Makes you think about the impact we have, not just on our kids, but on future generations. Speaking of impact, Rutherford disagrees with the idea that humans haven't evolved any new superpowers lately. What does he think our modern superpowers are?
He says our real superpowers are our brains and how adaptable we are to different environments. We've developed language, built complex societies, and created technology that lets us shape our world in ways no other species can.
So our creativity and problem-solving skills, those are our strengths.
Exactly. Those are what let us thrive almost anywhere on Earth and change the world to fit our needs.
It's a reminder that evolution isn't just about physical changes, but also our minds and cultures evolving.
Absolutely. As we face new challenges, our ability to think critically, solve problems, and come up with new ideas will be key.
This deep dive has been amazing. It's really changed how I think about genetics, about race, inheritance, even evolution itself. What are your final thoughts?
Genetics is a powerful field, always changing, and it gives us this unique view of our past, present, and future. We have to be careful with genetic information, not oversimplify things. Our genes don't decide our fate, but they show us the forces that shaped us as individuals and as a species.
I couldn't agree more. For everyone listening, keep exploring the world of genetics and embrace how complex and interconnected life is. If you haven't yet, check out Adam Rutherford's A Brief History of Everyone Who Ever Lived. It's a really engaging book that will make you see yourself and your place in the world differently. And that wraps up this episode of The Deep Dive. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time for another fascinating exploration.